In this video, I will be talking about different levels of social work, especially with how it affects me. I'm going to split this video into two parts. The first one explaining what the micro, meso, and macro practices are, and how it relates to me. And the second part will be about some comparisons of the skill sets that we need for each practice. I want to preface this video by saying it's hard to neatly sort different positions into clean chunks. In fact, doing so is probably an exercise in folly. Most of the time, I imagine that if, for example, you are doing micro practice, you would also be doing a lot of work that involves the macro and meso practices. I know for sure that when I was working in childcare, I would do a lot of administrative tasks that weren't necessarily involved with the children or making the program better. These were things like social media and administration, just to name a few. In social work, we are in the business of building relationships. But that's not just going to mean people. It will also be about building relationships with organizations and with society as a whole. I think part of the reason that we want to acknowledge the different levels of practice is to guide how we focus our work. So let's get to it. So to start, I want to reiterate what the micro, meso, and macro practices are. There are a lot of graphics giving examples of each level of practice, but I chose this one by Sandra Rosenbaum's School of Social Work because they provide a neat overview of the levels of practice. The micro level operates at an individual or small group level. This includes caseworkers who provide people with support to get the resources they might need. This also includes people who facilitate individual and group therapies or any sort of counseling. From what I've gathered from talking to the people in the social work faculty, most people are most interested in this type of social work. I myself have worked at this level, in childcare and as a program facilitator amongst other things, and I did it probably for the same reasons that most of you would want to go in this area. Because it's an innately social experience that takes a lot of empathetic skill to thrive in. You need to be able to communicate with people, and more importantly, listen to people to even begin to do well in this area. And that seems to be the perception of social work. There's also the satisfaction of seeing your impact on others, and knowing that you made a positive impact, and that your clients, they're thriving in the environment that they're in. On the other hand, at the meso level, you're working at a larger scale than micro, but not as large as macro. At this level, you'll be working with organizations and communities, including the implementation of helpful programs in large groups, organizations, or small communities. For example, design and implementation of things like nutritional programs in schools, group exercise programs for the elderly, things of that sort. Remember that, as social workers, people who work at this level will typically focus on using these programs for interventions to help vulnerable populations. And this is the level that I find I want to work at, for a few reasons. I mentioned briefly during lecture that I wanted to work at this level, partially because of the frustration I had while working at the micro level, at the front lines. This was not my experience everywhere, and it's probably pretty rare. But whenever I felt there was something lacking in the workplace, it was hard to do something about it. Partially due to the limited time that we have working on the floor. We're supposed to be with our clients after all, or working on the case at hand, but also because there's this chain of command, and depending on your supervisor, you may or may not receive the support that you need. Another big reason I like the idea of working at the meso level is because it lets you provide different experiences for different people. At this level, you're supposed to identify where this organization or group may benefit and design interventions that may help. And that's a lot of free expression. If you identify one issue, say osteoarthritis in elderly populations in suburban Calgary, I chose this because I wrote a paper on it in second year, so that's something I kind of have an idea of what I wanted to do. Maybe I'll get into it. How would we design interventions around this? So we'd have to consider things like the population, access to resources, how it affects the larger community, the scope of your intervention. And I think depending on how you want to focus your efforts will determine how you run your programs. Are you focused on education so that your population is better aware of preventing or addressing this issue? Are you focused on treatment or therapy? How are you going to deliver this in a way that's accessible to the population? How involved is the community at large going to be in these efforts? Just like how each individual is different with different needs and goals, communities of individuals also respond differently to different interventions. So being attuned to how people are affected by these programs is really important. And at the macro scale, we have a lot of policy making and advocacy. Things like research and campaigning, and of course politics, are all part of this. I find that just from conversing with classmates and other people I know in the social work programs, this is the least populated field, at least speaking directly about people in social work. I suspect that part of this is because of the same reasons that micro is so popular. And this is because you're not working directly with clients to help their immediate needs. but instead you're working on the system, the environment that they're in. And I think that people in social work are typically more appealed to the idea of working with people rather than systems. That said, this is also where large-scale permanent and future issues can be addressed. And I don't think a single one of us would ever understate the importance of this level of practice. And at the end of the day, this level of practice seems to be of a different kind. And here's what I mean. This was a graphic tweeted by the National Association of Social Work, or NASW, which is the largest membership organization of professional social workers in America, compared to the CASW, or the Canadian Association of Social Work. So NASW shows this infographic, and notice how they have the same descriptor for micro and meso practices, but a different one for macro. What's especially notable is the requirement for an LCSW, or a licensed clinical social work license. At the macro level, there's no expectation that a person holds a clinical social work license, which makes sense. You don't need to diagnose or treat mental health challenges, so your education might be better placed elsewhere. The skill set that you need to work at the macro scale is very different than working at the micro or meso levels. But as social work, there's a unity in the ideals and overall goals. In the next part of the video, I'll compare these skill sets to help elucidate what it means to work at different levels. And just as a side note for the LCSW, for those who are curious, you need one to practice clinical social work in the US, depending on the state. In Canada, depending on the province, you apply for an RCSW, or Registered Clinical Social Work License. So at this part of the video, we're going to be looking at some different skill sets that are necessary for working in the different levels of practice. At the micro scale, you see that people who work in this micro scale are focused on the individual. I took a look at the duties and responsibilities of a caseworker, typically a micro level social work practitioner. And this is what it says on Indeed. They are to interview clients to assess their current situations and challenges, determine what social services and additional agencies the client needs, assist clients in developing necessary skills for social and personal challenges, investigate child and senior abuse or neglect, and take authorized action as required, working with a team of professionals to ensure that the client receives proper therapy, counseling, and other services, and manage the progress of the client and adjust services as required. And you can compare that to a community organizer, which operates at the macro scale or meso scale. These people have to identify the structures and people that can help the community achieve the appropriate solutions, negotiate with these people to solve the community's problems, and establish an institution that the community controls democratically with a purpose and capacity to face future problems. So I don't want this part of the video to be just about looking at Indeed job descriptions. I want to focus on how I interpret these responsibilities. First, notice the audience that the social workers communicate with. Caseworkers are working with the clients who are asking for support. They are interviewing, assisting in skill development, managing the client's progress, and any of their other responsibilities revolve around the client. On the other hand, the community organizer is often working with people who are not necessarily within the population of their clients. They're speaking to people that can help. This may or may not include people outside the community or population that they are working with. For example, an advocate in the disability community who wants to improve the accessibility of public buildings and services would have to speak to a lot of different people. They would, of course, have to include the community to get an idea of what services and changes they are advocating for, and to receive support for their advocacy. But after that, they have to step outside the community and reach out to funders, to policymakers, to building owners, and maybe even architects, depending on how they handle the project. And these people are not necessarily going to be part of the disability community, nor might they have an understanding of how these changes are going to be made for the people in this community. Now, you might remember this figure from the lecture videos. This is on Assessing Levels of Practice by Toby Dunn. This figure was developed by Dr. Ellen Pearl. I wanted to comment on this, since it does take a look at how people working on each side of the social work practice, where they differ, but just as importantly, where they are the same. We are making comparisons between the community and the individual, environment and psychological, common good versus individual development, reform versus adjustment, democratic power versus expert power, innovator versus technician, and social action versus psychotherapy. This is something I wish they spoke more about in explaining, but I'll share to you what I can gather. We're seeing how there are broad categories that we need to consider as social workers when performing our practice. For example, reform and adjustment. Both of these concepts relate to how we want to make changes to improve the lives of the people we work with. At the macro scale, we achieve our goals by making social reform to change either the environment or the communities around the populations, so the challenges of the communities are addressed. On the other hand, At the micro scale, we look towards making adjustments around the person's environment to better fit their needs. One that I really wanted to look at was the democratic power versus expert power, which seems to be about the basis of power for us to make our changes. So I'm not really sure what these figures exactly mean, nor what Dr. Ellen Pearl really meant by them, but a quick search on expert power reveals that this is a term used by French and Raven's basis of power, which they define as the ability for an agent to bring about changes. So expert power is power that comes from having knowledge and experience, being an expert. And this definitely highlights the need for evaluating a person as having any expertise when working in this field, either through training, education, or experience. Now, I couldn't find a clear reference for democratic power, so I'm going to extrapolate what this might mean from its comparison with expert power. The same theory that defines expert power also defines another type of power. It's called legitimate power, which comes from holding a position that has authority over what is trying to change. For example, this includes the prime ministers, the CEOs, monarchs, things of that sort. So I'm going to assume that this democratic power is related and relates to the idea that people operating at the macro scale bring about changes by way of the people, by rallying and gaining the right supports. And because we live in a democratic society, the people holding democratic power will often interact with the people holding legitimate power to make their changes. The people will have to interact with the people in charge. Of course, I'm ultimately speculating here. I'm not sure what Dr. Ellen Pearl meant when she wanted to make this figure, nor what she meant by expert or democratic power. But at least I hope that there's some truth in here that's valuable for you. And the last thing I want to bring to your attention is this figure in the middle, the common values, mission, and theory that ensures that all social workers are working towards the same goal. At the end of the day, even though the way we perform our practices might look different, we're still working towards the same goal. And I will end the video by providing some of my own thoughts on the subject. I'm a person who loves academic theories, but I also kind of hate them. Here's what I mean. Academic theories are often useful since they provide us with ways to converse about the patterns and observations that we have. What I mean by this is that it's useful to be able to say micro, meso, and macro without having to explain that I mean people who focus on individuals and small groups, and people who focus on influencing the environments and systems around groups of individuals. It's time-consuming and repetitive. And it's useful to make these generalizations because they let us focus our efforts. If you want to work in the micro scale, then generally, having expert power and knowing that you want to make adjustments is useful. Where I am wary is that sometimes theories can distract us from what's really true or helpful. Focusing too much on being a micro-level practitioner may distract us from learning about the larger scale practices when it's helpful. Just as a hypothetical, we might ignore our role in creating outreach and exposure and awareness, because those are typically larger scale practices. And my awareness comes from the fact that I've gone through academia already and learned about a lot of different theories in different fields. And what I've noticed is that when I was in my first year of undergraduate studies, I learned a lot about theories. And while most of them were true, for the most part, they didn't paint the whole picture. Nonetheless, I believed them unquestioningly. But as I continued, I learned more about the contradictions and amendments to these theories. So, we have to look at everything critically and notice when a theory is insufficient for explaining what we're observing. In summary, social work practice is typically classified into 3 scales. Micro practice means working with individuals or small groups. Meso practice means working with large groups or communities. And macro practice means working on society and social structures. Depending on the level of practice, different skill sets are required. Micro practitioners work directly with a client or small group of clients in order to make adjustments so that their needs are met. While macro practitioners work with different people, and they necessarily need the support of large groups of people to make their changes. However, they are all unified by the common values, missions, and theory. I also want to add that Meso is not in this picture, and that upsets me. So that's it. Don't like and subscribe, but do leave a comment. I'll see you in the next one.